Trump melts down after Jasmine Crockett exposes what he didn't read. The screen is black, then static, the sharp snap of a mic being turned on. A sudden cut to the Capitol lights blaring cameras, whirring breathless tension in a room full of suits and silence. And then it hits. You signed this, didn't you? It doesn't seem like you understood a single word of it. That voice, calm, sharp, deadly precise, belongs to Reporter Jasmine Crockett. She doesn't blink. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. The air shifts like a storm just passed through. Trump's team won't admit it, but they felt it too. And for the first time in a long while, the political theater didn't belong to him. No slamming fists, no wild accusations, just a thick white document and a single line that tore the illusion apart on live television. That was the moment. Not a meme, not a gaffe, a reckoning. And Trump he unraveled in real time. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to understand the setup. Donald Trump, the man who once declared he had the best words, the self-proclaimed deal-maker-in-chief, sat miles away in Mar-a-Lago as a woman in a tailored blazer quietly dismantled the myth his followers have clung to for years that Trump knows what he's doing. Crockett didn't accuse him of being incompetent. She didn't have to. She held up his signature. And then she asked the question millions have whispered behind closed doors, did he even read what he signed? That's what made the clip viral. Not just the statement, but the silence that followed. The silence of realization. The kind that makes you pause mid-sentence. Rewind. Watch again. The kind of silence that hits harder than any scream. Social media exploded. Trump can't read trended within minutes. So did Jasmine Crockett clapback. But beneath the memes and edits synced to trap beats was something far more dangerous for Trump. People were no longer laughing at him. They were questioning him. And questioning, especially from within, is where power starts to rot. Back in the hearing room, the temperature never changed. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply added with the precision of a surgeon. The American people deserve leaders who can read the fine print before they sign the future. That was it. No theatrics. No emotional crescendo. Just that. And that's what made it nuclear. This wasn't just a takedown. It was a mirror. A sharp, unflinching one held up not just to Trump, but to every voter who ever said, he's a businessman, he'll figure it out. Held up to every strategist who said, just keep it short, he doesn't read. Held up to the entire machinery of American politics that allowed someone to rise to the presidency without ever having to prove he could comprehend the documents that shape people's lives. It was one sentence, 14 seconds, but it shattered the foundation. Meanwhile, in a cream-colored private room at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump stood frozen. The TV was paused on Crockett's face. His face was red. His hand was clenched around the remote, which had already clattered to the floor. She said, I didn't read it. On live TV, no one in the room said anything, because they knew. They'd been there. They'd handed him the documents. They'd watched him sign. She embarrassed me. He barked. His voice cracked. His team froze. One aide tried to mumble something about media framing, but Trump wasn't listening anymore. He was pacing, muttering, clicking into Truth Social, typing so furiously it sounded like a drumline. The post he fired off minutes later read like it was written in crayon, she's a disgrace. Document was fake. I'm a reader. Best reader. Ask anyone. I signed millions of papers. All legal. She should be kicked out. Spelling errors? Repetitions? Missed punctuation? It was exactly what people feared and expected. A man unraveling in public. And yet, the worst part wasn't the post. It was what followed. Because across the country, the people who'd once defended him, voters in suburbs, veterans, small business owners, the backbone of his base, weren't laughing anymore. They were uncomfortable. And that's what made it lethal. Not Crockett's words. Their silence. In a barbershop in Georgia, a man who voted for Trump twice stared at the clip playing on someone's phone. He didn't speak. He just shook his head and muttered, "If my kid did that at school, they'd say he didn't do the homework." In a church basement in Iowa, a retired Marine asked his pastor, "Is it really too much to ask that our leaders read before they sign? These weren't liberals. They weren't coastal elites. They were loyalists starting to wonder." That's what Jasmine Crockett ignited, not outrage, but reflection. And that's far more dangerous to a man like Trump, because a scream you can shout over, but silence. Silence sinks in, silence spreads. And when that silence is built on truth, it doesn't fade. It festers. It transforms. It grows into something uncontainable. That's how revolutions start, with a woman in a room, holding a document, and a question that can't be ignored. That's how revolutions start, with a woman in a room, holding a document, and a question that can't be ignored. But here's the thing about truth: it doesn't stop at the microphone. It travels. It echoes. And sometimes it finds its way into the very paperwork meant to stay buried. That document Jasmine Crockett held up wasn't random. It wasn't just some legislative footnote. It was a landmine. And she knew exactly where to step. Page 19. 42 pages in total, double-spaced, clipped neatly for display. But the bomb sat silently on page 19 waiting. The clause was technical. That's how these things always work. Language buried deep enough to discourage even the most curious reader. But Crockett. She used to comb through documents like this for tenants on the verge of eviction. She was built for this. What Trump signed wasn't just a contradiction. It was a betrayal of his own words, his own image, and most damning of all, his own base. Because 1 week before that hearing, at a town hall in Reno, Donald Trump had stood before a cheering crowd and declared war on what he called greedy corporate loopholes. He promised to close every single one. He said CEOs shouldn't be rewarded for gutting jobs. He said America deserved fairness, not fraud. Those were his words, his moment. But what Crockett exposed on national TV with the whole country watching was that he had already signed the opposite. A clause allowing expanded tax breaks for executive bonuses, exactly the kind of loopholes he claimed to despise. He didn't just forget. He lied. Or worse, he never knew. Either way, the truth had a timestamp. His signature sat right there above the clause that would give more leeway for large corporations to reclassify executive pay as performance-based incentives. In plain English, bonuses for the rich, deductions for the powerful, and a bigger burden for everyone else. Crockett didn't spell all that out on live TV. She didn't have to. The press did the rest. By that afternoon, policy analysts on Bloomberg were already digging in. CNBC ran a segment breaking down how the tax clause would disproportionately benefit companies with executive pay packages over $10 million. The clip went viral, not for the numbers, but for the realization. This wasn't policy confusion. This was hypocrisy in black and white. And worse, avoidable if someone had simply read the damn document. Suddenly, Crockett's question wasn't rhetorical anymore. It was forensic. "You signed this, didn't you?" America answered for him. Yes, he did. And that's when the shift became visible. In Lorain, Ohio, a man named Javier Ortega, owner of a small landscaping company, sat at his kitchen table with a copy of the document printed out in front of him. His wife had highlighted the relevant section in yellow. "I thought he was on our side," he said quietly, flipping between Trump's speech in Reno and the clause in front of him. He said he was against this. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The contradiction was too loud to ignore. Stories like that started cropping up everywhere. In factory break rooms in Michigan, at veterans' halls in Nevada, in the kind of places where political winds don't shift often, but when they do, they matter. This wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans anymore. This was about credibility. And Crockett, with that one question, had ripped the mask off. Her team never confirmed how she got the full document. Some said she pulled it directly from the Oversight Committee's records. Others whispered that someone on the inside leaked it, knowing she would use it with precision. Either way, the moment wasn't accidental, it was earned. Because what Crockett understood, and what Trump never seemed to grasp, is that the fine print isn't just paperwork, it's power. And when you don't read it, you give that power away. Or worse, you use it carelessly. That's what made this moment more than political theater. It became a parable. The man who once held nuclear codes couldn't or wouldn't read a 42-page tax initiative. And the woman who once drafted emergency motions in a broken-down office above a payday loan center, she read every word. And then she told the truth. Quietly. Directly. On the record. The press followed the trail like blood and snow. By the next day, legacy outlets had pieced together the timeline. March 3rd, internal policy brief, circulated March 9th. Trump signs full version of the bill at a private rally in Fort Wayne. March 10th, the public statement claiming he never approved any pro-CEO tax leniency. March 17th, oversight hearing Crockett brings the receipts. The collapse wasn't loud. It didn't happen all at once. It was slow, structural, like something crumbling from within. And inside Trump's orbit, panic was setting in. His advisors scrambled to reframe the issue. First, they claimed the clause was inserted after he signed. Then, that he was misled. Finally, they said it was bureaucratic noise, irrelevant in the big picture. None of it stuck. Because Crockett had already laid the foundation for a far more dangerous idea, that, maybe the man at the top never knew what he was doing. And that's a thought that lingers. It lingers when you're watching your rent go up while reading about corporate bonuses being written off. It lingers when you pay taxes and see billionaires get refunds. It lingers when the man you voted for calls himself a genius, but can't explain the laws he signed. And most of all, it lingers when someone like Jasmine Crockett, young black, direct with no stage theatrics, sits behind a desk and calmly exposes the truth without breaking a sweat. That's what terrified them. Not just that she was right, but that she was ready. And that's what terrified them. Because readiness is dangerous in Washington, especially when it comes without apology, without spectacle, without permission. Jasmine Crockett didn't storm the stage. She studied it, mapped every trapdoor, and waited. Then she struck not with volume, but with certainty. And that certainty triggered a meltdown they couldn't script their way out of. Inside Mar-a-Lago, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to fracture. What had started as a moment of viral embarrassment was now metastasizing into something far worse, internal disintegration. The next morning, 8 people gathered in a thick draped conference room on the second floor, the kind of room that muffles voices, as if even the walls know secrets don't stay hidden for long. Trump's campaign manager, his top PR handlers, 2 comms aides, a legal liaison, a strategist with sneakers under his suit, and 2 junior staffers who mostly nodded and took notes. The energy was wreckage. "He looks unhinged," said Colleen Darrow, one of his most senior communications directors, scrolling through the late-night Truth Social post again. Jasmine Crockett. "That's what we're going with now. He thinks it's clever," someone muttered. "No, he thinks it's retaliation," Colleen snapped. "It's self-sabotage." Ray Mangan, the young strategist with his laptop open and sneakers tapping against the floor, leaned back. "Do we even know what was in that document yet?" "We're defending him blind." Everyone turned to the legal liaison. Risa Feldman looked like she hadn't slept. "It's real," she said softly. "The clause is real. It was inserted months ago. He was briefed in Indiana. 2 pages summary. He refused the full version. And he signed it anyway." Risa nodded. Didn't want to waste time with numbers. Silence. Not the kind that pauses a conversation, but the kind that sinks it. The kind where people start staring at their shoes because they don't want to be the first to say what they're all thinking. He didn't read it. And that wasn't a one-time slip. That was protocol. Because inside Trump's operation, skimming was standard. Bullet points. Color-coded memos. Talking points short enough to tweet. Anything longer got ignored. The entire campaign machine was built around protecting him from complexity. But Crockett had just turned that survival strategy into a liability and exposed it to 300 million people. We've been building everything around a guy who doesn't read the fine print, Colleen whispered, and attacks the people who do. Ray added, now it wasn't just embarrassing, it was unmanageable. Glenn Borkin, Trump's longtime advisor, finally broke the tension. He doesn't want us on camera, he said. No appearances, no press conferences, nothing. Not until further notice. Ray's eyes narrowed. We're going dark. He doesn't trust us. Says we're not defending him hard enough. How the hell are we supposed to defend a man who can't even explain what he signed? No one answered. Because that wasn't a strategy question anymore. That was existential. Across the country, the Crockett clip was still circulating, now dissected in slow motion with CNN overlays and TikTok remixes. One user spliced Trump's Reno speech over footage of the document, highlighting every contradiction in red. Another set the moment to dramatic orchestral music and added subtitles, "This is not leadership. This is negligence." But the virality wasn't the real issue. It was the doubt. For the first time, conservative voters weren't defending him on instinct. They were hesitating, whispering in Facebook groups, asking real questions. In a diner outside Tulsa, two older men sat sipping coffee. You think he really didn't know what was in that thing, one asked? The other shrugged. I'm starting to think he doesn't know what's in any of them. That wasn't rebellion. That was erosion. Back in Mar-a-Lago, Trump sat alone in his private suite, staring at a paused image of Jasmine Crockett on the television. Her expression still, her posture upright, that document in hand. The quote beneath the screen in bold, "Then leadership means nothing to you?" He hated that line, not because it was wrong, but because it stuck. Like tar. He reached for his phone again, opened Truth Social, typed furiously, "She's a disgrace. I wrote the document. I understand everything. Better than Obama. Better than Biden. Best reader. Ever." He hit post without spell check. No commas, no pacing, no edits. Within seconds, it exploded. Not in his favor. The comments rolled in, "Sir, are you okay? Who even writes like this? Wait, you wrote the document. Isn't that what you said? You never saw?" Fact checkers pounced. CNN ran a segment comparing his claim with legislative records. The document had been authored by a policy team vetted through legal and delivered to Trump with a 3-page summary. There was no version of reality where he wrote it, and that lie more than the document itself pushed people over the edge. Because this wasn't miscommunication anymore. This was delusion. Inside his campaign, the team splintered. One aide walked out. Another broke down crying after a late-night call with a journalist. Nobody could spin this. There was no clever reframe. Crockett hadn't insulted him. She hadn't mocked him. She hadn't even raised her voice. She had simply held the mirror and said nothing while the reflection spoke for itself. And the reflection was chaos. Veterans started speaking out. A retired Marine with a backyard video went viral. Holding a weathered Constitution, he said plainly, "I had to read this in boot camp. Every page. Because I swore to defend it. If our leaders can't do the same, they don't deserve the title." It wasn't left or right anymore. It was clarity versus noise. And for once, clarity was winning. Because what Crockett exposed wasn't just Trump's laziness, it was how fragile the illusion of competence had become in American politics. He didn't read the document. He didn't understand it. And when he was caught, he lied. Loudly, sloppily, publicly. And still, she didn't react. Because Crockett knew something his team hadn't figured out yet. You don't fight chaos with chaos. You don't outshout noise. You let the truth hang and let people hear the silence it leaves behind. That silence echoed louder than any headline, louder than any rally chant, louder than all the noise Trump's machine could throw back. Because silence is only unsettling when it says something you were trying not to hear. And now, people were listening not to her voice, but to their own thoughts. And those thoughts, they weren't pretty. In suburban kitchens, on factory floors, in break rooms and back porches, That one sentence. It doesn't seem like you understood a single word of it was being repeated. Not shouted, whispered, wondered about, passed along like a question people had been afraid to ask out loud. What if he really doesn't know? Inside Mar-a-Lago, the walls were beginning to buckle. Not physically, not yet, but structurally, ideologically. Trust was leaking out of the room like steam from a broken pipe. The people closest to Trump were now navigating not just damage control, but moral whiplash. We're running a campaign for a man who won't read what he signs. Colleen Darrow finally said aloud in one internal call, and attacks anyone who points it out like they're the enemy. She didn't shout, she didn't accuse, but the words hit like a freight train because everyone in the room had known it for years and said nothing. That's the problem with enabling chaos. It doesn't need your approval, just your silence. Meanwhile, Crockett kept moving. No victory lap, no talk show tour, just calm, precise messaging. When NPR asked her what she hoped the public took away from the hearing, she didn't mention Trump by name. She didn't have to. When you have power, she said you have a duty to understand the weight of your choices. Otherwise, the people paying the price are never the ones signing the paper. Simple, steady, devastating. And the country noticed. Not just Democrats, independents, disillusioned moderates. Even Republicans who had once stood behind Trump were now questioning their own blind spots. Melinda Rausch, Trump's former education advisor, broke ranks during a late-night podcast. Her voice was calm but laced with something deeper regret. I wrote memos for him, she confessed. I saw how short they had to be, how we avoided nuance, because he didn't have the patience for detail. That's fine when you're branding hats. It's deadly when you're writing policy. That quote detonated across the media, because it wasn't Crockett exposing him this time. It was his own. It wasn't political betrayal. It was moral clarity. And what made it land wasn't just the words, it was the repetition. Over and over, from people who had stood behind him, came the same haunting refrain, I don't think he read it. In small towns and cities, churches and union halls, people repeated the phrase. Not with hatred, with disappointment. In a bar in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a woman scrolled through the clip and showed her husband. He just signed it, she asked. Like without checking? Seems like it, he said, staring at the screen. Would you let your kid do that? No, she answered. And he had the nuclear codes. That's when the sentiment shifted from spectacle to concern. Because this wasn't just about a tax clause anymore. It was about how we excuse power, how we celebrate ignorance when it entertains us, how we forgive recklessness when it comes with a flag-wrapped slogan. And Crockett, without needing to shout, had made people reckon with that. But while the public reckoned, Trump retaliated. At 11:26 p.m., he posted again. Jasmine Crockett is a fraud. Didn't even read the doc. I wrote the doc. I have the best comprehension skills. Way better than Sleepy Joe. Way better than Barack. Best signature, too. Millions of papers. All legal. She should be removed. It was a mess. A grammar graveyard. But worse, it was provably false. Within minutes, journalists dug up the legislative chain of custody. The document had been drafted by a policy team, vetted by legal counsel, then given to Trump with a summary. He didn't write it. He didn't even read it. And now he was lying about both. That lie, more than any other, peeled off another layer of loyalty. Not because it was shocking, but because it was stupid. Even his allies had trouble spinning it. On a Tennessee conservative radio show the next morning, a usually pro-Trump host hesitated. I love the guy, he said, but this doesn't help. Makes us all look unserious. Like we're following someone winging a book report. That's when the cracks turned to splits. And in those splits, new voices emerged. A retired Navy veteran posted a video in his backyard holding a tattered pocket constitution. I read this cover to cover, he said, because I had to swear to defend it. If our leaders don't read the laws they sign, they're not defending anything. They're performing. And I'm done cheering. The video was shared over 2 million times. Not because it was radical, because it was honest. That's what made Crockett's attack so powerful. It wasn't an attack, it was accountability, delivered without fury, without personal insult. Just a reminder that power is supposed to come with responsibility, not vibes. And while Trump shouted into the void, she stayed quiet. She read, she prepared, she showed up, and she waited. Because she knew the truth has its own gravity. And once it lands, it pulls everything around it down too. That's exactly what was happening. The truth had landed dead center in the middle of American political consciousness, and now it was doing what truth always does when it's real, raw, and undeniable. It was forcing people to choose. Not between parties, not even between candidates, but between the comfort of denial and the discomfort of reality. And reality? It was getting heavy. Cable news had pivoted by now. What started as a viral soundbite had evolved into a national conversation. Segments weren't just replaying the clip anymore, they were dissecting the implications. Legal analysts explained what the clause in the document actually meant for everyday Americans. Economists broke down how the expanded loopholes would shift the tax burden to small businesses. And pundits left, right, and center were finally asking the question Crockett never had to say aloud. If he didn't read that document, how many others didn't he read? That question lingered like a smoke alarm no one could shut off. And while Trump's base initially tried to rally, calling the document a deep state forgery, accusing Crockett of staging a hit job, the energy faded quickly. Why? Because the facts were traceable. The document was real. The signature was real. The contradiction was public. No amount of noise could reverse what people were starting to feel. A shift. Even inside the conservative strongholds. A sheriff's deputy in rural Utah, speaking anonymously to a local paper, put it simply. If a rookie in my department signed a report without reading it, I'd suspend him. Why should we excuse that in a president? It was no longer about hate or loyalty. It was about standards. That's what made it dangerous. Because Crockett hadn't embarrassed Trump. He had done that himself. What she'd done, calmly, precisely, was expose a weak spot in the mythos he'd built for years, that he was always in control, always sharp, always the smartest guy in the room. Suddenly, that room looked very different, and that myth. It started leaking at the seams. At Mar-a-Lago, the mood had calcified into dread. The team didn't speak in complete thoughts anymore. Their sentences were sharp, jagged, unfinished, because everyone was bracing for the next outburst, the next post, the next moment of unscripted combustion. Glenn Borkin, ever the cautious voice of reason, called it for what it was during a hushed campaign call. He's not bouncing back from this, he said. This isn't just a PR fumble. It's character exposure. And worse, it's competence exposure. But it's just one document someone pushed back. No, Borkin said quieter now. It's a symbol. And symbols are sticky. They all knew it. Because what Crockett had triggered wasn't just a media cycle, it was a mirror. And once people start seeing something clearly in the mirror, it's hard to go back to squinting. Even former staffers began speaking out. One who had served on Trump's communications team during the early White House days appeared anonymously on a podcast. We used to build around the fact that he wouldn't read, she said. Memos had to be less than a page. Bullet points only. Sometimes we just bolded the words he liked. It was about managing the illusion of engagement. And then she dropped the line that stopped everyone cold. But at some point, it's your name. It's your pen. You don't get to say, "not my fault," when you're the signature at the bottom. That quote, just like Crockett's question, cut deeper than any insult ever could, because it was accountability in a form America wasn't used to. Not angry, not performative, just true. And the public felt it. In town after town, the ripple effect started to show. Not in dramatic protests, but in quieter, more honest conversations. Grocery store lines, barbershops, church pews. One man in Scranton, Pennsylvania, told a reporter, "I don't even care about taxes. I care that he lied, and that no one around him had the guts to stop him." A high school civics teacher in Sacramento printed out the document Crockett had referenced, handed it to her class, and said she had page 19. Then read Trump's Reno speech. Now tell me, was that a mistake or a lie? A student in the back replied, if it was a mistake, it was a dangerous one. If it was a lie, it's worse. That moment, like Crockett's question, wasn't loud, but it was honest. And that honesty was catching on. Online, the backlash Trump expected never came the way he wanted. His truth social outbursts were mocked, not mobilizing. His attempts to label Crockett as radical fell flat because she never lost control. Never took the bait, never made it personal. She just kept showing up. Calm, clear, prepared. And while Trump's allies fumbled for new talking points, Crockett issued only one public statement. We encourage all elected officials to fully read and understand the documents they sign. We don't respond to playground insults. That was it. 12 words that hit harder than any meme, any insult, any spin. Because it reminded people what grown-up governance is supposed to look like. And in contrast, Trump's unraveling looked not just erratic, but childish. His next Truth Social post confirmed it. Everyone knows I read. I have a higher IQ than most of Congress. I know more than the writers. Crockett is a fake lawyer. Never heard of her before. I'm the best at documents. The post went viral, not because it was strong, but because it sounded like satire. One user commented, "Sir, if you have to shout, 'I'm the best at documents,' you probably aren't." But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about us, about how we let charisma replace clarity, how we forgive sloppiness because it comes with a slogan, how we cheer for performance and ignore the paperwork. And now, people were waking up. Not all, not immediately, but enough. Enough to start asking the right questions. Not what team are you on, but do you know what you're signing? And when leaders flinched, stuttered, or attacked the person asking that, said more than any speech ever could. And it kept happening. Over the next week, as the media cycle churned, and America moved from hashtags to headlines, to the next inevitable drama, one thing refused to fade the question. That simple, unassuming, inescapable question. Did you read it? It followed Trump like a shadow. Not shouted, not weaponized, just quietly asked again and again, like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. At rallies, reporters began slipping it in. At town halls, voters started referencing page 19. At a fundraiser in Phoenix, a donor whispered to an aide, "I want to support him. But if he didn't read that thing, how can I explain that to my son?" The damage wasn't just political, it was foundational. Because it didn't feel like a partisan attack anymore, it felt like a breach of trust. One that millions of Americans recognized not because they hated Trump, but because they had lived versions of it themselves. They'd signed things they didn't fully understand. They'd trusted people in power who didn't deserve it. And they'd paid the price. And suddenly, the idea that the former president, the man they once believed had their back, had been doing the same thing only without consequences. That stung. In places Trump had once carried with ease, counties in Ohio, parts of Florida, stretches of Pennsylvania, the conversation had changed. Not dramatically, not in polls, but in tone, in doubt. I'm not turning Democrat, one man said on a call-in radio show, but I'm tired of being made to feel like reading is optional. My kid's teacher says, if you don't read the instructions, you fail the assignment. Why is it different for the president? That sentiment, grounded in basic logic, was the very foundation Crockett had quietly built her moment upon, and she wasn't done. While Trump's team scrambled, Crockett doubled down, not with insults or rebuttals, but with education. She went on NPR, calmly walking through the full 42-page document, line by line. She explained the clause buried on page 19. She connected it to tax burdens on small businesses, rising corporate deductions, and a pattern of political negligence. When asked if she thought Trump was illiterate, she didn't take the bait. That's not the point, she said. I care whether people in power are responsible, whether they understand the decisions they're making. I've worked with families who lost everything because someone skipped the fine print. We cannot afford that kind of leadership at the national level. It was surgical, not personal, and because of that, it hit harder. People leaned in not because they were angry, but because they were thinking. And that, in the political era of outrage and distraction, is the most dangerous thing a voter can do. Pause. Think. Ask better questions. By the following week, a poll conducted by a nonpartisan research group showed a subtle but significant dip in Trump's trust numbers, not favorability, not ideology, but trust. And that mattered more than cable news spin ever could. Because once trust erodes, slogans lose power. Meanwhile, Crockett's moment had become more than a clip, it had become a case study. High school teachers were assigning it in civics classes. Law professors were using it to explain the ethics of executive accountability. One university even held a forum titled Signature and Consequence: Why Reading Still Matters. In every case, the same idea echoed through: leadership is not performance. It is responsibility, and responsibility starts with comprehension. That concept, though, simple struck at the heart of Trump's public persona, a man who sold decisiveness over diligence, instinct over intellect. For years, it had worked. People didn't just accept the image, they admired it. He gets it done, they'd say. No BS. But now it looked different. Now it looked lazy, careless, worse, dangerous, especially when the decisions being made weren't branding deals or television scripts, but federal policy. And Crockett's strength, her poise, her preparation, her refusal to play the game on his terms amplified that contrast. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call names. She simply held up the paper and said, "You signed this. And based on your statements, it doesn't seem like you understood a single word of it." That line wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. And in it, millions of Americans saw something that unsettled them. Not just a leader bluffing through complexity, but a system that allowed it, that celebrated it, that rewarded it with applause, money, and votes. Until now. Because the silence after her words, that viral, tangible, world-stopping silence, wasn't just Trump's. It belonged to all of us. A collective realization that we'd let things slide too far, that we'd prioritized spectacle over substance, that we'd cheered for swagger while ignoring the homework. And Crockett. She wasn't trying to be a star. She was just trying to put the homework back on the desk. At her next public appearance, she was asked what the moment meant for her career. "I'm not thinking about my career," she said. "I'm thinking about the single mom who signed a lease she didn't understand. About the veteran who trusted a benefits form and got denied. About the business owner who got squeezed by a tax change no one explained. I'm thinking about what happens when no one reads, and how we punish the powerless for that, but excuse the powerful." That quote, humble and razor sharp, became its own echo. Because Crockett wasn't asking for outrage. She was asking for standards. And maybe, just maybe, that's what scared Trump's team the most. Not the virality, not the memes, but the return of something they had long dismissed as outdated expectations. Of knowledge, of competence, of integrity. As the dust settled and the headlines moved on, one truth lingered: it wasn't about Trump anymore. It was about how we let ourselves believe that charisma could replace comprehension. That instinct was enough. That reading the fine print was for staffers, not leaders. And Jasmine Crockett, with one question and no raised voice, cracked that illusion wide open. So, what now? That's the real question. Not who wins the next news cycle, not which party scores the next soundbite. But what kind of leadership do we demand? If the answer is someone who fights, then we haven't learned the lesson. Because fighting without facts isn't leadership, it's chaos. And America has had more than enough of that. But if the answer is someone who understands, then Crockett's moment becomes more than a viral clip. It becomes a compass. A reminder that preparation still matters, that truth still resonates, and that leadership, real leadership, starts not with shouting, but with reading. The document, the stakes, the future, all of it. Because the next time someone signs a paper that shapes your rights, your wallet, your world, you better hope they read it. And if they didn't, you better hope someone like Jasmine Crockett is in the room to ask the question. Calm, unflinching, and undeniable.